Thanks for checking in today, and we're going to talk about ratios, fractions, decimals, and percents. So just a quick review. Remember, a ratio is just any number that can be written in the form A over B. The only exception here is that B, the denominator, cannot equal 0. So that's the only restriction there. For interest's sake, let's say that we are talking about 5 dogs and 8 cats. All right, and my pen is going, so we're going to go green. That sounds pretty good. So if I was writing a ratio to compare these 5 dogs to the 8 cats, if I asked for the ratio of dogs to cats, the ratio would be 5 to 8. Well, when we talk about ratios, there are a couple of ways to write a ratio. So we can have a simple ratio, like we just wrote. We could write it as a fraction. We could write it as a decimal. Or we could write it as a percent. So let's talk about how to do that. I like to first draw a chart with a couple of columns. I like to start with ratios on the left. And it's going to have 4 rows, so I'll put a little squiggly down the middle. So ratios. And in the middle here, we would have our fractions. And then we would have our decimals. And in our last column, we will put our percent form. So let's still talk about our 5 to our 8 dogs to cats. So as a ratio, I would write this as 5 to 8. If I write that as a fraction, 5 is the numerator, 8 is the denominator. So it's still the same number, just written in a different form. To change this fraction to a decimal, we really just need to look at this ratio. This really means 5 divided by 8. So 5 divided by 8. Well, let's go ahead and do our division. I'm going to put the 5 down there as the dividend. I'm going to put my decimal point up here and put my 8 out here. 8 goes into 50 6 times, which is 48. 50 minus 48 is 2. Going to bring our 0 down. 8 goes into 20 2 times, which is 16. Subtract remainder of 4. Bring our last 0 down. And 8 goes into 40 5 times. So here's our decimal. 5/8 converted to a decimal is 0.625. Now, to change a decimal to a percent, what we do is we move the decimal point 2 places to the right. And what I like about this chart, we are moving to the right, so that kind of helps me remember that I'm going to move this decimal point 2 places to the right. So my decimal point is in front of the 6, and I move it 2 places. It's now going to be behind the 2, so this would be 62.5%. That's fairly easy. Just remember. So ratio as a fraction, the first number is the numerator, second number is the denominator. To change a fraction to a decimal, it's the numerator divided by the denominator. To change your decimal to a percent, you take the decimal point and you move it 2 places to the left, and that would, you have to make sure you have your percent symbol after the number. All right, let's try another one. Do our little line. What if we're talking about the ratio where we're going to compare cats to dogs? Then we would have the ratio 8 to 5, and that is a different number. So as a fraction, that would be 8 over 5. To change our fraction to the decimal, that would be 8 point, I'm going to give myself 3 zeros and then divide. So 5 would go into 8 one time. Subtract, that gives you a remainder of 3. Bring your 0 down, and 5 goes into 30 6 times. Want to make sure we've got our decimal point in there. So as a decimal, this is 1.6. To change 1.6 to a percent, we have to move the decimal point 2 places to the right. So that would be a 1/6, and with this extra space here, we would add a 0, and that would be 160%. Sometimes your percents will be more than 100%. Well, it's easy to work the chart from ratio to fraction to decimal to percent, but what if I'm given a percent and I need to change it to a fraction? Well, let's say I had 80% and I needed to change it to these other forms. I'm going to the left on the chart, so my invisible decimal point is really at the end of the 0. And since I'm moving left, all I'm going to do is move my decimal point 2 places to the left, and that would give me 0.8 as a decimal. To change a decimal to a fraction, this is often the easiest to do, but the hardest to remember. If you're going this way, if you just say the number out loud, sometimes you'll hear yourself say the number. So if I was to say this out loud, this is 8/10. So that is the fraction 8/10. And we know that fractions always need to be in lowest form, so I can divide by 2 and reduce that to 4/5. And then to change that to a ratio, that would be 4/5. So if we're changing from a percent to a decimal, we move the decimal point 2 places to the left. That would give us 0.8. To change 0.8 to a fraction, just say the number out loud. This is 8/10. We're going to reduce that fraction to 4/5, and then we're going to change that to a ratio 4/5. Pretty easy. You guys are doing great. Now, let's do another. Let's say that we have, again, we're going to have our ratio, fraction, decimal, and percent. So let's say I have the ratio 2/3. So as a fraction, that would be 2/3. To change to a decimal, that would be 2 divided by 3. 3 goes into 20 6 times, which is 18. 3 goes into 20 again 6 times, which is 18. Another remainder. Oh, bring the next. So I've got this 0.666, which you remember is what we call a repeating decimal. So this would be 0.6 repeating. So if we change this to a percent, we have to be careful with this one. If we're moving the decimal point 2 places, we have to remember that that is a 6, not a 0 here, since this repeats, and that would now be 66%. So just be careful with your repeating decimals. You don't want to put a 0, you need a 6 there. All right, the next order of business. Let's practice ordering fractions, decimals, and percents. Let's say we have the following numbers. 65%. Say we have the fraction 5/7, the decimal 0.63, and the fraction 16/25. Well, let's change these first all to decimals. So if you have a chart, you can do that on the chart. We might be pretty good at it by now. We know to change a percent to a decimal, I move the decimal point 2 places to the left. So this would be the same as 0.65. To change 5/7 to a decimal, we are taking 5, dividing 7 into 5. 7 goes into 50 7 times, which is 49. 7 goes into 10 1 time, minus 7. remainder of 3. 7 goes into 30, another 4 times. But since we've divided to the thousandths place, we have probably divided far enough. So we'll call 5 sevens 0.714. 0.63, I'm just going to write this over here, is already in decimal form. And 16 25ths. Well, we could do 16 divided by 25. But we could also create an equivalent fraction if 25 and 100, we know that 25 is a multiple of 100, so it's easy to change this. We know that decimals and percents are based on tenths and hundredths. So if I change this to 100, we did 25 times 4. So if we do 16 times 4, that's going to be 64 out of 100. And we know that that's automatically 0.64. So just another way to convert some of your fractions to decimals. So now if we look at our numbers, we have a 0.65, a 0.714, 0.63, and 0.64. So if we ordered these least to greatest, we would see that 0.63 was the least, 0.64, 0.65, and then 5 sevenths was the greatest. So to reorder those, 0.63, and then 16 25ths would be next, then our 65%, and last would be our 5 sevenths, in order least to greatest. And generally, most people prefer to change to decimals, but you always have the option to change everything to a fraction or to a percent. All right, well, thanks for checking in. Have a great day.